Three Tree Island. The Brewster's cabin was built in 1673 after the family moved from Bedford to make a life in the New World. Settlements had been established for some time in Massachusetts. Most new arrivals preferred to set up homesteads closer to Plymouth or one of the other main ports. John Brewster had initially thought to build in Salem, but decided the Indian problem there was too much of a risk. His wife Mercy did not agree, but no more than a stern look from the patriarch was required to regain order and compliance. Their first winter had been harsh, but they got through it with the help of their Christian neighbors, the Whites and the Aldens, who had also elected to break fresh ground. John had seen Indians and even managed a few conversations with low-ranking warriors. He subsequently felt comfortable regarding his relations with the savages. They engaged in trade and kept their interactions cordial but transactional. The poor yield of their first crop was a far greater concern. Their neighbors were well acquainted with the ways of the local Wampanoags, who had taught them how to fertilize the soil with kelp. Although it was a trek of some 15 miles to the coast, the families went together and gathered what they needed collectively. This collaboration and support increased the yield at their second harvest, and John was able to buy the other goods they needed to make it through winter. Joshua Brewster turned 16 in late October. He obeyed his father primarily from fear of seeming disrespectful. The constant threat of the strap weighed on him. The belligerent man treated him like a child, even though he had grown into a strong young man. His father would tell him how precious he was, but threaten him all the same. Although he spoke of God, the wrathful hand was his own. "The sin is in you," he hollered. "I see it in your eyes. The sin is in you." John Brewster often spoke of being a religious man, a pious, God-fearing believer. This narrative of faith and conviction made it difficult to see the wickedness in him for what it was. He was cruel to his wife Mercy, who he dragged outside and beat the way he encouraged their ox. The way he thrashed her was no more restrained or respectful of her modesty than the beatings he gave their son. She was forced to lift her skirts and lower her breeches. All this was done in the sight not only of God, but also Joshua's watchful gaze. On other occasions, it was Mercy who stood silent witness as her son was stripped and lashed, often for assumed infractions, sins of thought rather than action. John claimed to burrow into the cellars where they concealed their worst offenses. When in late February of 1675 John Brewster took to his bed with influenza, his wife and son did not perhaps minister him so much as witness his return to God. Mercy discussed the best treatment for his condition with Abigail White and Harmony Alden. There had been a conspiratorial glint in the women's eyes when they agreed it was best to starve it out. This moment of what seemed like collusion did not escape Joshua. They gave the man of the house a little broth and plenty of hot tea, but he did not improve. They feared falling foul of the sickness themselves, but it was impossible to maintain distance in such close confines. God must have had other plans for them, and even as the devil himself tempted them, they feared no term in hell. God had surely decided to punish a man whose chastisements had been severe, degrading, and unjust. On the night he died, they sat and listened to the wind where it howled. The storm seemed to permeate the man and rattle in his lungs. They could hear ribs cracking the way a ship's timbers groan in a tempest. He sweat, and the stink of him, his premature putrefaction, seemed further evidence of divine disavowal. If God had abandoned him, by what right should they intervene? His eyes bulged from his sockets whenever he awoke. He tried to speak, but in his weakened state he could rarely manage more than a guttural moan. The man, however, in all his completeness, remained evident to them. He lowered a haughty expression of judgment upon his wayward wife and son whenever consciousness allowed. At his final hour he bolted upright in bed and glared angrily at them. His body trembled against the howling wind, and his face flinched and tensed before he could speak. "I curse you!" he said, as if heaving each word up from the depths of his soul. "For eternity, you and anyone who joins you in this God-forsaken neck of the woods." With these words he collapsed on the bed and gasped. A gale whipped through the pines and echoed in his chest. They leaned over him and watched as a look of horror and loathing settled on his features. He whispered, "Mercy." His body relaxed and froze in place. His lips twisted with his wife's name. It was difficult to believe he had called out for her when only moments before he had cursed not only his wife, but her son and anyone who lived in these woods. "There will, I fear," she said, "be no mercy for your father." The mixture of emotions the young man experienced proved a heady mix. He felt the presence of his father for weeks after they buried him behind the cabin. Solomon Deggery and Peter White came to help dig the grave. A fire was needed to soften the earth. It burned all night, and only then could they lay John Brewster to rest at an acceptable depth. Words were spoken over the man rather than of him. Even Peter and Solomon showed no grief at the loss of the man. They found him rigid and difficult to work with. They liked the lad and his mother well enough, and promised to keep an eye on them, but John they had never cared for. The winter had nearly finished gnawing on the remnants of the previous summer's feast. It had grown weary and could not compete with the newborn spring. The change of season drew out vigor and optimism in Joshua. He and his mother toiled in the fields. Unlike the efforts of the previous summer, their work was joyous. They laughed and sometimes sang hymns as they worked the earth. Mercy was a strong woman, stronger than his father, it seemed. She was hardened by the life they led in the colonies, and the Brewsters did not always attend church as often as they should. They had even worked on the Lord's Day once, just to be sure the corn was planted. They crossed the holy threshold often enough to avoid their absence being noted or commented upon. Abigail and Harmony ensured any aspersions cast fell short of the mark. They would not hear anyone question the piety of their dear friend. Joshua sat beside his mother in high summer and gazed out over the cornfield. It was June, and the sun burned where it rained over them. It had been nearly a week since Mercy had seen Abigail and Harmony. They planned a picnic out near Little Elk Lake, and had sent word with Peter, who offered to convey the widow in their cart if she wanted to join them. Joshua rarely had any time alone, so he excused himself and stayed behind. The cow they bought in spring needed milking, and there were chickens to feed. His mother was not like his father. She trusted him and treated him like the young man he had become. She waved him goodbye as she gazed over her shoulder from Pete's cart. They had been alone since winter. Although neither of them said a word, they both surely experienced a sense of liberation. The cabin was no longer John Brewster's stomping ground. He could not step from the grave to beat them or lord over them with dark prayer. With his mother safely en route to a picnic, he could do his chores and spend idle time daydreaming. He was in the middle of a shallow fancy when the warriors came hunched and painted through the ripening corn. Their bodies were adorned with red and black paint, and together with the green leaves and stalks, they made a strange optical arrangement. There were as many as 6 or 7 of them, and there could be more lurking in the woods. Word had spread of King Philip's discontent, but Joshua and his mother had prayed to the Lord to spare them any mischief. His father's musket was in the cabin, and even if he were able to retrieve it, he would only be able to bring one of them down before the others broke his skull. As there were no other Christian souls for miles around, he had stripped to the waist. He decided not to show any fear, and stepped free of the shadow of the cabin. He stretched out his arms as if to embrace them or his death, whichever came first. "Lord, forgive me," he whispered, "all my sins of thought and deed." He could see no trace of blood on their tomahawks or clubs. They had not drawn arrows or stretched their bows. There was no apparent leader among the small band until one of the warriors took the lead. He was a well-built man in his early 20s, his sinew and muscle flexed in the sun. His head had been shaved except for a small bunch at the back of his head. This tuft of hair was surrounded by feathers. A black band was painted across his eyes, and the lower part of his face was smeared red. The same paint also adored his naked torso and legs. He held up his war club, and the others stopped where they were. He came closer to Joshua, inspected him the way he had seen his father look at horses or the ox they finally settled on. The savage called something to his companions in a language Joshua did not know. The Christian lad recognized it as Wampanoag or Narragansett. It was a local language, but his father had forbidden him from learning any heathen tongue. The warrior spoke directly to him, and perhaps the look of perplexity on Joshua's face amused him. He smiled with a set of clean white teeth. "We lose a friend," the warrior said. "You befriend." Joshua smiled and almost laughed with relief. These people meant him no harm. They had not come as part of King Philip's war against the invaders. The warrior told him his name, but Joshua could not understand. "My name," the warrior said, "is Bear in Winter." Joshua nodded. "I'm Joshua Brewster." "Bear and Joshua." The Indian's face became serious. "I put rope here." He gestured to his throat. "We take you." He struggled for words, looked around, and saw their ox where it had been tied to a post. "Like your ox." Joshua stepped back. His heart began to thump in his chest, and he withdrew further toward the cabin. "You come, Joshua," the warrior said, "or my friends will kill you." There was no doubt in his mind. The warriors were on a raid. One of their number had been killed, and he was to be the replacement. If he struggled, the best he could expect was serious injury, but most likely he would die. Bear held the rope in his hand. He looped it and tossed the noose around the lad's throat. He brought it tight and pulled Joshua toward the tree line. "Please don't do anything to the farm," Joshua pleaded. "We will take the ox," Bear said. "Burn the cabin and fields." "My mother's on her own," Joshua whispered. The warrior said something to his companions. One of them ran and untethered the ox. They whooped, and together they headed into the forest without further molesting the homestead. Joshua watched as he was dragged away every bit as unceremoniously as the ox. They hiked all day without stopping. Occasionally Bear offered Joshua water, but their progress was never impeded. The forest became thicker, and mosquitoes alighted on him until a warrior rubbed grease over his exposed torso. The scent was not dissimilar to bacon. It warded off the insects, and he became more aware of the tiredness of his limbs. At nightfall, they camped, and he expected they would slaughter the ox and make a feast, but they did not. They lit no fire and shared only a mix of berries and smoked meat. The combination was far more satisfying than Joshua expected. After some banter, the warriors lay down to sleep. In the open air, the night was cold, and he shivered where he lay on the bare earth. For perhaps an hour, Joshua huddled, cold and frightened, beneath the moon. Then Bear approached and wrapped him in a blanket. The warrior lay beside the young Christian and drew their bodies together. Joshua could feel the heathen's breath where it brushed his shoulder. The warrior's arms were strong and held him in a firm grip. "You are safe," Bear whispered. "I will not let anyone hurt you." The heat generated where their bodies rubbed against one another was enough to make the blanket feel heavy. Bear pressed himself closer, and his hands began to caress Joshua as his lips brushed the boy's shoulder. The night lingered and breathed as uneasily as the young men who lay entwined beneath the moon. It would not draw back the lids of day or offer them release. The confusion he suffered was redoubled throughout the following day, where the band hiked further through the forest to lands no white man had ventured into. Bear made sure Joshua ate, was watered and tended. The others noted the affection their fellow warrior showed the captive. They chuckled amongst themselves and treated Joshua more like a guest or one of their own. Before the close of the second day, they arrived at a small village. There could not have been as many as 30 heathens living in the one long house. There were fields of high corn and meat dried out in the sun alongside stretched hides. The chatter of women and children sparkled like embers in a hot fire, and the warriors were greeted warmly with great affection and reverence. Bear took Joshua to a stream to wash his captive. The prisoner was then presented to an older person of importance, in front of whom Bear and Winter made an impassioned speech. The assembled tribe listened, and no effort was made to remove Joshua from the warrior's possession. The old man in an elk robe spoke soberly for several minutes. Later, Bear explained how their chief had listened and decreed ownership of the captive to him. The Indians danced around a fire. Joshua watched as the drums beat and the savages howled. Their bodies were leaned and shined with bear grease. The fire made their skin glisten, and there was a joy to it he failed to recognize as evil. It was a celebration of a successful homecoming. Only one woman mourned, and her wailing was banished to the forest. Bear explained she was the mother of the warrior who died fighting the English. She was supposed to be given Joshua as a new son, but Bear wanted the Christian for himself, and the chief agreed he had earned the right. Toward the midnight hour, they lay together in a distant corner of the long house. Bear seemed intent on having what he had won. He removed Joshua's clothes, and when the Christian resisted, the Indian reminded him of the mother he left behind. "She is safe, with a place to rest," Bear whispered, "because I would not hurt you." The tenderness of his words broke through Joshua's defenses. The savage was no longer painted head to toe. He had washed the war paint away in the stream. Without his mask of violence, the Indian's face was much the same as any other man of substance. His nose reminded Joshua of a Roman emperor he had seen in a book before they left England. He was a noble, attractive man, strong and capable of great kindness and compassion. Bear caressed him, and did things no Christian would ever do without seeking penance and forgiveness. He touched him with his hands and lips, and finally he pressed himself inside the lad and took him. It was not a purely selfish act, and had it been, perhaps Joshua would have felt more protected. The warrior was determined to provide as much pleasure as he himself was taking. This element of their union unsettled the heart and culture of a young man who now yearned for his father's strap. For several nights their evenings were spent in similar passions. Before he knew what had happened, he felt the bond spread tentacles throughout his body like some oceanic monster from the depths. He imagined John Brewster beating him, thrashing him, and telling him, "The sin is in you. I see it in your eyes." And there it was. His father had recognized what he had never imagined possible. He had seen the depths of his son's depravity, how the boy yearned for unnatural practices, the wickedness of the devil himself. Although he registered this in the sinew of his being, Joshua could no longer resist the advances of his lover. It got so he suffered whenever Bear headed off into the woods to hunt. He sat in a kind of sickening dread, a despair of belief. What if his protector did not return? What if those arms never again enfolded him? In his darkest hours, he feared his father would step from the shadows and drag him down to hell. As soon as they were reunited, however, all seemed right. The world settled as their bodies rediscovered their union and teased it through till morning. After a month or 6 weeks, it was impossible for Joshua to keep count of the days. A warrior from another band arrived. They sought fighters to join King Philip's war against the English. Although Joshua pleaded with him not to go, Bear said he must fight and save the land for the people. "Otherwise your white brothers will push us into the sea." He reached out and stroked the lad's cheek. "If we ignore this threat, we will find ourselves making homes on Cuttyhunk." Joshua's face furrowed with confusion. "Cuttyhunk?" "In your tongue," Bear said, "it means the power that lies out in the sea." Their final night together at the end of the long house was perhaps the most meaningful of all. The tenderness and firmness of his lover was interchanged so imperceptibly as to make the hours moan. Joshua did not sleep. He caressed his lover and soothed him, enticed him to stay and enjoy the bounty of their union. Although the warrior was tempted, the drawer of his duty pulled him from Joshua's arms. Of course, had Bear in Winter been any less a man, he would have rejected him, fought him off, and been made a changeling. So he watched with the others as the warriors painted themselves and headed off into the forest. He did not know what to expect once his protector had gone, but the people showed him nothing but kindness and respect. A younger warrior took him on hunting expeditions and taught him how to use a bow and set a snare. It was during a hunt the idea of escape first presented itself to Joshua. Even after such a short term among them, the people saw him not as a captive, but as one of their own. He waited more than a week to see if the warriors would return, and when they did not, he simply walked into the woods one evening and followed the stream as he had done with Bear and the others. He tracked back as far as he could during the night and rested until first light. He feared the tribe would send a party out to search for him. He spent a restless night and slept only in fits and starts. At daybreak he drank water from the stream and walked through the day. He had taken note of the path they traveled and was pleased by how much he remembered. There were several key markers, and for half a day they had followed a stream east. He noted the direction from the position of the sun. Once he found his way to the stream, he was confident of finding his way home. He slept a second night beneath the stars and shivered without Bear's embrace. He tried to speak his man's name in their tongue, but the language was so foreign it shuddered forth a shadow of his father's threat. The night was lonely, and he half hoped the people would find him and drag him back with a rope around his neck. He did not honestly believe they would look for him. He was not important enough, and he was a free man. When he arrived at the cabin, there was no one there. The corn wilted in the fields, and the cow and the chickens were gone. He drank his fill of water and raced to the Whites' homestead. Abigail explained how Mercy had gone to stay with the minister. She dragged him inside, found him a shirt, and bade him wash himself before he put it on. She prepared food, which he ate. Then he thanked her and set off to the church. He walked until dusk, when the steeple rose through the trees. A small encampment of Mohegan people lay in clusters of smoking huts around the house of the Lord. Minister Hands came out onto the steps. Perhaps the old man had seen him slip through the trees, but there was no doubting his pleasure. "Oh, I say," Isaac Hands said, "your mother will be delivered." He ushered the exhausted young man inside, and there in a back parlor sat his mother with two Mohegan women. She was sewing, and they watched her every move. When she saw him, her eyes lit up and tears rolled over her cheeks. They embraced, and the return to the fold was a comfort and a penance all its own. Over dinner, the gentle minister found the inquisitor in his blood and began to question the young man. There seemed to be suspicion in the air, and although Joshua dismissed this as the fever of imagination, he could not ignore it. "Tell me again, my son," Hans said. "These savages stole through the cornfield and came upon you?" "Yes," Joshua said. "They seemed intent on blood, but for some reason they decided to take me and the ox and be done with it. Perhaps they feared retribution for their wickedness." "Perhaps," Hans sighed. "And you were naked and defenseless, you say?" Joshua's gaze rested on his mother. She was nothing but an abundance of kindness, the very heart of care. His shame burned through him, and he recalled the way Bear had studied him as he stepped from the shadow of the cabin. "I was alone, with no one but the Lord to watch over me," Joshua said. "It was hot, and I had taken off my shirt. There was no wicked intent, no immodest thought." Hands tapped the tabletop, and a cynical expression flickered in the candlelight. Each moment seemed unnaturally extended, drawn out the way an inhalation of tobacco is enjoyed. The old man's tongue peeked between his lips like a lizard on a foreign shore. It quickly took refuge and was not seen again during dinner. "We must be vigilant," Hans said. "The devil is often no more than an aspect of our own being." Your father understood this well. He realized that putridity of thought is often more insidious than any external force of evil. These savages, I am sure, made attempts to draw you away from God's love. Joshua admitted the people had tempted him with their ways. but he could not even think of his worst sin without sensing the darkness of his soul. He would build a fortress around his remaining purity and have the perversion beat from him. The epiphany struck him the way the lash of his father's strap used to strike. "Minister Hans," he pleaded, "I have sinned gravely against our Lord. I beseech you, take up my father's strap and beat the wickedness from my tormented soul." He had buckled his father's strap around his waist the day the warriors abducted him. He loosened it and handed it to the minister. He stood before Hans and begged him to do right by God. Throughout, his mother sat and trembled as if the world no longer made sense to her. Joshua bent over the table, and the first few strikes were so mild he could not feel God in them at all. He gripped the edges of the table and pleaded with the minister to strike as he would the very demons of hell. Hans struck him harder, but there was still no love in it, no power or authority. "Let God strike me," Joshua cried out. "Let our Lord chastise me." Then the power and the strength of the Almighty laid into him hard enough to leave bruises and welts. Hans worked himself up into a frenzy, and it made Mercy weep pitifully. Joshua felt not only the Lord, but the sweet caress of his lover. Nothing, it seemed, would compel the heathen to retreat from the shadows of his soul. Over the course of the next year, battles were fought and won on both sides, and by the close of 1676, King Philip's head had been placed on a spike in Plymouth. There the trophy remained for 10 years. Joshua stayed out of the fight and took to courting Catherine Alden, the youngest daughter of Solomon and Harmony. He kept their farm going and was set to wed the pretty young girl when she turned 15. Ever since his brief encounter with the savages, he half expected Bear to return and reclaim him. The warrior had probably died in the first few months of fighting alongside many others. Joshua could not help feeling aggrieved whenever he thought of it. When he looked at Catherine, he saw only God's purest love and duty. There would never be another who could turn him from the light and make him embrace such unnatural desire. He had taken to going hunting with Peter and Solomon. The company of these seasoned men was an inspiration. They were not preoccupied with God the way his father had been. They lived within the tenets of the Lord's law, but enjoyed the nature of their being as men. They were rugged realists who did what was necessary to survive such a rough, untamed land. They trekked out one afternoon to Little Elk Lake in search of wild turkey. They found no trace of the birds they sought, but did encounter 3 Wampanoag warriors. The canoe moved silently where dusk cast low shadows over the water. In this half-light, the Indians remained partially obscured, and only the keenest eye could spot them. It was Joshua who saw them, and had he not raised the alarm, his compatriots may not have seen them. "Look yonder," Joshua whispered. "There on the water." The Christians spoke among themselves, and each elected a separate target. There were 3 of them and 3 savages on the lake. They lined up their sights, whispered to one another, and on the count of 3, they fired. The canoe was overturned, and the wounded Indians struggled towards an island which sat toward the middle of the lake. The hunters took their time and reloaded their muskets. As the warriors crawled onto the shore, the settlers fired a second round and left the invading savages to bleed out. Peter waded into the lake to retrieve the upturned canoe and brought it to shore. He and the others rowed out to the island, parted each savage from his scalp, and set a fire to burn the bodies. They sat out on the island until the scalps had stopped bleeding and the coals no longer thirsted for fat from the warriors' bones. As they rowed back, Joshua looked over his shoulder. What a terrible, lonely spot for the warriors to spend eternity. Without their bodies, they would never find their way on the other side. They would stumble around in utter darkness, and perhaps they would remain on the island and wail to their ancestors forever. Mercy never returned to the farm. She stayed on with Minister Hans, and Joshua occasionally wondered whether his mother ever strayed with the man who represented their faith to heathen children. Of course, he knew she never had or ever would. It was him she could not face, the son who had stepped willingly back beneath the lash. For several nights, Joshua could not sleep. He tossed and turned, and all he could think of was the murdered Indians. He replayed his part in the massacre and could never absolve the sin. Over the course of a week, an irrepressible idea took shape in his mind. Late one evening he set off to the bank of Little Elk Lake. He pushed the canoe into the water and paddled across to the island. There he planted 3 saplings to mark the places where the warriors had been butchered. He pressed the earth around the trunk of each new life as gently as if it were the chest of his beloved. The tears he cried were of no comfort, and they did not facilitate a release. He stayed out on the island for most of the night and collected the bones of the slaughtered warriors. It seemed right and proper to give the remains a decent burial along with the scalp he had taken as a souvenir. He strained to hear their voices or see their faces, but death had stolen them from the universe. Here in this lake, surrounded by familiar water, he hoped they would find their way to the ocean, to the power that lies out in the sea. Joshua married Catherine as arranged, and they had 3 sons and a daughter. He never returned to the island, but watched as the trees grew strong and tall, while he buckled beneath the weight of time. He never told his children what happened when the Indians captured him. He did, however, tell them the story of Three Tree Island and why it had been given its name. 3 armed fishermen, he said, out on the lake when 3 men of God gunned them down. The poor defenseless savages bled out on the island, and a tree sprouted where each had fallen. He never once let on that he was one of these men of God, but perhaps they could hear it in his voice. Who knows what they saw in his eyes, but had they looked closely, they may have seen bear in winter. An image of the proud warrior continued to burn in Joshua's eyes until the fire of his soul was extinguished the way the pyre on Three Tree Island slowly burnt itself out.